I used to think that lockdown drills were pointless in my school because nothing ever happened in our tiny little town. I learned that I couldn't have been more wrong though, and I'll forever be thankful for those drills because they're most likely the only reason that a lot of kids in my grade are still alive today. It all went down during our pre-prom assembly. We had all heard about the assembly from seniors that had to go through it the previous year, and according to them, it was super boring. It was pretty much an hour-long talk about why drinking and driving was bad, something that we were all well aware of, but it didn't even make it 5 minutes into the speech before all hell broke loose. It may have been 4 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Miss Belmont was walking across the stage as she prepared to show a video on the dangers of drinking and driving on prom night. Everyone in the auditorium was quietly talking amongst themselves as they pretended to listen to her talk, but within a matter of a second, silence came over the entire room. Around 200 high school juniors fell silent as the sound of gunshots rang out from the hallway. The way our school was laid out, our auditorium was placed right inside the main entrance, and from the sound of things, the shooting was coming from near the greeter's desk right on the other side of the auditorium doors. 2 shots were fired, and everyone inside the auditorium quickly lowered themselves down into our seats as we listened in hopes that we had all misheard what was going on, but that clearly wasn't the case. Before anything else happened, I'll never forget how calm and collected Miss Belmont was as she spoke over the microphone and told all of us to follow our typical lockdown protocols. All of us turned our attention away from the auditorium doors and looked at the teachers up on the stage as they all gestured for us to slowly come out of our seats and make our way up the stairs next to the stage. Surprisingly enough, we all did our best to stay calm and followed the teacher's directions as we formed multiple lines leading up the stairs to the auditorium stage. The room was beginning to fill with quiet muttering as we all worried about what was going to happen to us, and I remember looking around to see if I could find any of my friends. We all slowly made our way onto the stage, and then one of the teachers walked us over to an emergency exit that was located right on the other side of the curtain. He began ushering people through the door, which was what we were all taught to do since the auditorium doors didn't lock properly. After exiting the door, we were supposed to make our way into the hallway between the auditorium and the music classrooms, and from there, we were supposed to go right into those classrooms and lock the doors as we waited. I was toward the front of the line, and I remember feeling the teacher pull me forward to keep the line moving as we began walking out into the hallway. However, I didn't make it 2 steps out of the door before the few of us that made it out all stopped. We were stunned to see the gunman had made his way around the auditorium and was now looking down the hallway that we're all standing in. We quickly turned around and began forcing our way back into the auditorium as we all yelled that the shooter was in the hallway. We could hear shots being fired as bullets hit the walls near where we had all been standing. Thankfully, we all managed to make it back into the auditorium, and the teacher quickly closed the door behind us. He grabbed a ladder that was right next to him and stuck one of its legs through the door handle and used the rest of the ladder to bar the door shut. It came just in time too, because as soon as it was secured, we could hear the man on the other side of the door trying to force it open. We all quickly stepped away from the door as another teacher made their way around and tried their best to secure all of the emergency exits in a similar fashion. As the next couple of minutes passed, we could periodically hear the sounds of shots being fired throughout the school. Each time it seemed like the gunman was getting farther and farther away, but that didn't matter. Every second that passed, we were all horrified that he would come back our way and try to get into the auditorium again. It took 9 minutes for the police to arrive, but when they finally got there, they cleared out the school and managed to take down the shooter without having to fire a single shot at him. The shooter turned out to be a substitute teacher, and although the 2 greeters along with the school security guard ended up getting shot, they all made full recoveries, and as far as I know, they still work at the school. That was hands down the most terrifying day of my life and the most memorable school assembly that I ever attended. It wasn't until my sophomore year of high school that I learned the importance of keeping at least one ear open when you're in public. And by that, I simply mean don't have both headphones on when you're out of the house. I learned this simply because I had both my soundproof headphones on during study hall one day, and I kept them on when I ran to the bathroom between classes. Well, it was during that time that the lockdown bell rang, and all of the students in the rest of the school were notified to get into the nearest classroom because there was an unknown adult on the premises. As I said, I had my headphones on and I couldn't hear anything, so when I walked out of the bathroom into a cleared out hallway, I just assumed that I missed the bell. I let out a sigh as I figured I was going to get in trouble for being late to class, and I started walking down the hall. As I made my way around a corner, I saw a man standing in the hallway looking around, and when he saw me, he immediately pointed in my direction. I thought that I was going to get in trouble, so I took my headphones off and immediately apologized and told the man that I was on my way to class. I just got held up in the bathroom. He told me that it didn't matter what my excuse was, and that he needed to escort me to class so he could talk to the teacher. I rolled my eyes and said all right as we both started walking toward my class. Right away, I started getting the weird feeling from this guy since he kept looking down at me but not saying anything. We made it to the base of the stairs that I normally took to get to my trigonometry class, which he would have known if he actually worked in the school. But instead of turning to go up the stairs, the man kept walking me down the hall that we were in. That was when I realized that, unlike the rest of the school staff, the man wasn't wearing any sort of school badge or name tag. My eyes widened as this stranger continued to guide me down the hallway, and I decided to ask him what class he taught. He responded by simply saying, "Don't question me." And then he placed his hand on the back of my neck and continued to walk me down the hall. As we made our way around a corner, I could see one of the entrances to the school and knew in my gut that this guy was trying to get me to leave the building. I knew that I didn't have much time, and all I could do was try to run. I started walking a bit fast to try to get ahead of him so his hand wasn't touching me anymore. And the second I felt the slightest bit of distance between us, I quickly spun to the right and sprinted right past him, back down the hall that we came from. I made it to the base of the staircase and started running up it as I heard the footsteps of the man chasing me. As I made it to the top of the stairs, I could hear him getting closer and closer. But thankfully, as I stepped out the staircase onto the second floor hallway, I saw two security guards who were looking for the intruder. I yelled to them that he was right behind me, and they immediately started running toward me. I turned around and saw the man as he made his way back down the stairs, and the school security guards pursued him. At that moment, I noticed one of the teachers across the hall from me gesturing for me to come into their classroom. So I did that as fast as I could and spent the rest of the lockdown waiting for them to tell us that the school was safe. My parents were called and I had to speak with the police after it was all over, and thankfully by the end of the day, they ended up arresting the guy after finding him trying to sneak through backyards in town. They believe he was trying to make it back to his house, which was also right in town. Ever since then, I will always pay attention to any announcement made when I'm out somewhere. For almost everyone, graduation is one of the best days of our lives, but I can think of an entire senior class of students that would disagree. You see, our school had this thing that we did for graduates called the graduation bonfire. It was an all-night event on the football field where the school would host a massive bonfire with music and food venues. It was the closest thing to a school fair that we had, and it was something that we looked forward to all year as seniors. That year, it was a particularly warm night, so a lot of us were hanging out near the water balloon station, just pegging each other with balloons and enjoying our last night at the high school. Everyone seemed to be having a really good time, and for a while, it sort of seemed like we weren't at a school event at all. It just seemed like the first day of summer vacation. That would all change pretty quickly though. After a while of running around and burning through our energy, my friends and I decided to grab something to eat from the barbecue station that one of the local farms set up for us. I had just made it about halfway between the water balloon station and the food tent when I heard the first gunshot. My eyes widened and you could almost feel the tension building in the air as silence came over the crowd. A silence that was broken by the sound of another gunshot, followed by a mass of screams. I turned to my friends who were all looking around, and I yelled to them that we had to get to the school as fast as we could. We started running through the field toward the side doors to the school that had been left open for students to use the bathrooms near the gym, and I noticed that a large group of our classmates were running toward the parking lot. That was when I realized that they had driven there that night and were lucky enough to get in their cars and leave. As for a lot of us, we relied on our parents to pick us up, so we had no choice but to run into the school. I made my way inside and quickly rushed up the stairs. I looked back at my friends and the students around us and yelled out that we needed to get as far away from the shooter as possible. so I suggested we get to the second floor of the school and try to find an unlocked classroom. We all rushed up the stairs as fast as we could, and by the time we made it to the second floor, it seemed as if our group had split in half, with some of the students deciding to take shelter in the first classroom they saw. There was no time to question anyone's moves, so my friends and I just continued moving forward and deeper onto the second floor toward the section of the hall that was farthest away from the football field. Once we were there, we knew there was no time to calm down as we could hear the sound of gunshots getting closer and closer. It's unclear if they were in the school yet, but we knew that they were at least heading that way. As we reached the end of the hallway, I began looking around for an open classroom, but sadly we were having no luck. And the more and more doors that I tried, the more time passed the closer the shooter got. I'll never forget the horrified look on my friend Madison's face as she ran over to me saying that she was pretty sure she heard the shooter coming up the stairs. We all began to panic as we continued opening any door that we could find and trying to force open any that was locked. Thankfully, one door finally budged and we were able to force it open. We all rushed into the bathroom that we had managed to break into, but when we turned to close and lock the door, we realized that we had busted through the lock when we broke in. That was when Madison whispered loudly to us that we should use the window. One by one, we quickly climbed out the bathroom window and onto the roof, and since I was the last one out, I made sure to close the window all the way in hopes that if the shooter found it, he wouldn't think to look outside. Thankfully I did, because no more than 5 seconds after I closed the window, we heard the sound of the bathroom door being pushed open and hitting the wall. As quickly and quietly as we could, we all pressed ourselves up against the wall next to the bathroom window, so if the shooter looked out, he wouldn't be able to see us. That was when we heard someone down below calling up to us. "Hey," a call came from down below. When we looked over the edge of the building, we saw 3 uniformed officers standing on the ground below. That was when the officer informed us that they apprehended the shooter. I looked over toward the window that we climbed out of, and the person that was walking up the stairs turned out to be a police officer who was checking the school for any students. We were all so grateful that we were safe. Sadly though, the principal of the school was sent to the hospital in critical condition before he ultimately lost his life. That was the last year that the school ever did the all-night graduation bonfire. My 2 best friends and I decided to go camping in the woods to spend some time away from the outside world. We thought it would be a great adventure and a great chance to connect with nature as well as each other. But it didn't take long for things to take a turn for the worse. We had been hiking for hours, blindly following a trail that we thought would lead us to the perfect camping spot. However, somehow we got turned around and ended up lost in the middle of nowhere. We tried retracing our steps, but every path looked the same, so it was hard to remember all of the turns we had taken to get to where we currently were. We started to panic. We had no idea where we were or how to get back to civilization. We tried calling for help, but didn't have any luck since there was no cell service. We were completely alone and it was going to get dark soon. As the sun started to set, we realized that we needed to find shelter for the night. The original plan was to walk until we found some sort of large tree to sleep under or maybe even a cave. Anything to keep us out of any rain that might happen. Oddly enough though, we ended up discovering something that at first we thought was our savior. We stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin and decided to take shelter there. It wasn't much, but it was better than being out in the open. We huddled together in the cabin, trying to stay warm and calm our nerves, although nothing could prepare us for the night that we were about to endure. As the night wore on, we started to hear strange noises outside. At first, we couldn't quite tell what it was, but then it became a lot clearer. It sounded like footsteps crunching on leaves. I tried to convince my friend that it was just an animal, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from out there. As the night went on, the noises grew louder and more persistent. We tried to block them out by talking and telling each other stories, but it was no use. We were too scared to even move, Suddenly, we heard a loud banging on the door of the cabin, and we froze. At that point, I was too scared to even breathe. Remaining quiet didn't help though, and the banging continued. After a minute of not responding, we could hear someone or something trying to force their way inside. That was when we sprang into action out of fear. We figured if it was a person or the owner of the cabin, they would have said something. And because we thought we were in danger, my friend and I tried to barricade the door with whatever we could find. Sadly, it was no use. The door burst open, and we were face to face with our worst nightmare. There was a man standing in the doorway, holding some sort of stick in his hand. Through the darkness, we couldn't see much, but it looked like he was wearing a tattered shirt and dirty jeans, and he had a crazed look in his eyes. He lunged at us, swinging his stick wildly. We tried to run, but we were trapped. The man took another lunge forward, this time bringing him squarely into the middle of the tiny cabin. That was when we took the chance and managed to get around him and ran back into the woods, not knowing where we were going. All I knew is that we just needed to get away from him. We could hear him chasing us, his footsteps pounding on the ground behind us. We ran for what felt like hours until we couldn't run anymore. We collapsed on the ground, panting and gasping for air. We were lost in the middle of nowhere, and we didn't know if we were still being chased by that madman. Eventually, we decided to keep moving, hoping that we could find our way out of the woods. As the sun started to rise, we finally stumbled upon a road. We flagged down a passing car and told them everything that had happened. The police were called, and they searched the woods for the man with the machete, but he was never found. We made it out of the woods alive, but we were never the same again. The experience changed us, and we never forgot the terror of being lost in the middle of nowhere with no way to escape. I was hiking in the middle of nowhere up in the canyons of Utah, miles away from civilization. The beauty of the scenery had me entranced, and I was enjoying every moment of my time there. But all of that changed when, oddly enough, I saw someone else on the trail walking in the opposite direction. He was coming toward me. At first, I thought it was just a hiker like me, but as they got closer, I could see that they were not there to enjoy the scenery. In their hand, I could see a long metal object, and as they got closer, I could tell clear as day that it was a blade of sorts. I didn't feel safe passing that person, so I ended up turning around and walking the other way. As I continued walking, I looked back over my shoulder and saw that they were now looking right at me, and it sort of felt like they were following me, and I knew that I had to get away. I had no idea who this person was or what they wanted from me. All I knew was that I had to get as far away as possible. I started running as fast as I could, and it felt like my heart was going to pound right out of my chest. As I was running, I took a second to look back over my shoulder, hoping that I misread the situation. However, I could tell that I was in trouble. The person with the machete was hot on my heels, and I could hear their footsteps behind me getting closer and closer. I didn't know how long I could keep up this pace, but I had to try. I looked back and saw that the person was getting closer. I could see the glint of the machete in the sunlight, and it sent shivers down my spine. I had to think of something, and fast. I saw a narrow path to my left that led into a rocky ravine. It wasn't much of a trail, but it was my only chance. I veered left and started scrambling down the path. It sounded like the person with the machete hesitated for a moment as if they weren't sure whether to follow me. But then they started down the path after me. I could hear their footsteps getting closer, and I knew that I had to move faster. I could feel the rocks scraping against my skin as I slid down the ravine, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get away from that person. I finally reached the bottom of the ravine and kept running. I didn't look back, but I could hear the person with the machete following me. I could hear their labored breathing and their footsteps slapping against the ground. I knew that I couldn't keep this up for much longer. I needed to find a way out of here. I spotted a small opening in the rocks up ahead and made a beeline for it. It was a narrow crevice in the rocks, but it was my only hope. I squeezed through the opening and found myself in what was like a small cave or den of sorts. It was dark and damp, but it was better than being out in the open. I huddled in the corner of the crevice, my heart racing. I could hear the person with the machete outside, but I couldn't see them. I didn't know what to do next. All I could think to do was to close my eyes and hope that they would continue running down into the ravine. It was like time was standing still as I listened for the footsteps of my pursuer. Thankfully, I eventually heard the sound of them running off in the same direction that he was chasing me. I waited about 2 minutes before poking my head out of my hiding hole, and when I did, I held my breath, hoping that I wouldn't see that man with the blade. When it was all clear, I quickly scrambled back up the ravine that I had slid down and made my way back up the narrow path. Once I was on flat ground again and back on the main trail, I took off running toward my car, and I felt more than lucky to not have run into that crazy person again. I made sure to call park services to let them know that there was a strange man who was chasing people on the trail. All I can hope is that they managed to find him before anyone got seriously injured. I had always heard that the Vegas desert could be dangerous, but I never believed it until I found myself out in the middle of nowhere and in perhaps the most danger I'd ever been in. While that trip may have started out great, I ended up making the worst decision of my life on my 3rd day there. After spending the first 2 days enjoying the city and the nightlife, I decided that I wanted to go out exploring. I had heard about a nice hiking trail from a group of people that I met at my hotel bar the other night, and I decided to go on a solo hike to check it out. I was feeling adventurous and wanted to explore the beauty of the desert on my own terms. I had everything I needed, including water, food, and a map. I thought I was prepared for anything, but I was wrong. You see, as I was walking, I made the mistake of not watching the ground ahead of me. I was too busy looking at the sky and landscape around me to notice any dangers that sat on the ground. I winced as I was walking the moment that I felt a sharp pain in my leg. I quickly looked down and was horrified to see a rattlesnake slithering away from me. I knew immediately that I was in trouble. I had heard stories of people dying from snake bites, and I knew I needed to act fast. I started to panic. I had already walked about 2 miles or more, and I wasn't sure if I could make it back to town on my own. As painful as the bite was, the hardest part of the entire experience was the fact that I was alone, with no one to help me. The pain was excruciating. I could feel the venom spreading through my body as the leg continued to throb uncontrollably. I tried to stay calm and remember what I had learned about snake bites. I knew I needed to keep my heart rate down and stay hydrated, so I started to drink my water and tried to slow down my breathing. But as the minutes turned into hours, I knew that I couldn't make it to safety on my own. That's when I remembered that the smartwatch my parents gave me for Christmas that year came with a GPS emergency beacon. I didn't hesitate after I remembered and immediately activated it, hoping that someone would find me in time. But as the hours passed, I had a feeling that no one was coming. I was completely alone, with no help in sight, and by that point in the day, the sun was going down. The pain in my leg was unbearable, and I started to feel weak and dizzy. I knew that I was running out of time. I needed to find a way to get help before it was too late. I started to crawl, using my arms to drag myself across the floor of the desert trail. It was slow going, and the sun was continuing to drop in the sky, but I knew I had to keep moving. I crawled for what felt like hours until I couldn't move anymore. The entire lower half of my body had gone numb, and my vision was starting to blur. I thought all was lost and was about to give up hope of being found when all of a sudden I heard a voice. I thought I was hearing things as I lifted my head from the dirt and sand to look around. That was when I saw a small cabin in the distance. It was the first sign of civilization I had seen in hours. Just the sight of it seemed to reinvigorate me a little and give me the strength I needed to press forward. I crawled toward it, hoping that someone was inside. As I got closer, the voices that I heard were getting louder. When I finally reached the cabin, I collapsed on the ground, barely conscious. But to my surprise, there was someone inside. An old man with a grizzled beard came out to greet me. He took one look at my leg and knew exactly what had happened. He told me that he had been living out there alone for years and that he had seen his fair share of snake bites. He had a kit with him that he used to treat the bite, at least enough for me to survive long enough to get some real help. After pulling me into his cabin, He introduced me to his wife, who helped me rehydrate a bit as the old man used a satellite phone to call for help. It took about an hour for the emergency services to get to us, and I ended up being brought to the hospital, which is where I spent my last 2 days in Vegas. According to the doctors and the old man, if I hadn't found his cabin, I would have probably been dead within the hour. The city of Vegas itself was interesting, but that experience in the desert changed me and made me a more cautious person. I never forgot the danger of the Vegas desert. It was a harsh reminder that nature can be deadly and that we should always respect its power. After my divorce from my husband was finalized, I waited a while before finally putting myself back on the dating scene. But when I did, the first app that I downloaded was Tinder, and that turned out to be the second biggest mistake of my life. The first is my husband, and not just because we got a divorce. You see, when I created my profile on Tinder, I was very honest that I was a newly divorced woman who was looking for someone to enjoy life with, even though I didn't know where that would lead. It wasn't long before I started getting matches and had to deal with an influx of guys there who definitely weren't looking for a relationship like I was. That is, until I matched with a man who said his name was Clark. He said that he had worked in construction most of his life, and we both bonded over the fact that we both own a German Shepherd. I loved my dog and Clark loved him, and before long we began really talking about our lives and all of the things we've done or haven't done. We chatted for a few weeks, and I'll admit there were a few times when our conversations turned a little bit R-rated, and eventually, we both decided that we would meet up and have dinner together. He claimed to be working a little late, but we were going to meet up around 8 p.m. at this Italian restaurant that was about half an hour from my house. As it was getting closer and closer to the time when I should have been leaving my house, I started getting dressed, but I was surprised when the power in my house went out. At that time, I was in my upstairs bathroom, and I began looking around for my phone so that I could have some sort of light to see where I was going. I wasn't sure what was wrong, but I figured the place that I should check was the fuse box. Once I managed to find my phone on the bathroom counter, I turned on the flashlight and then made my way over to the bathroom door. My entire plan changed as soon as I opened the door. I was getting ready to leave the bathroom when I heard the sound of something moving around downstairs. At first, I thought it might have been Jack, my dog. But then I remembered that I put him in the backyard to run around for a little while before I went on my date. I decided to poke my head out of the bathroom and try to see down the staircase in hopes of figuring out what was going on in the living room. But when I did, what I saw caused me to quickly duck back into the bathroom. As I poked my head around the corner, I saw the light of a flashlight shining from downstairs. I locked the door to the bathroom and immediately called 911. As I waited for the operator to pick up, I could hear the sound of footsteps walking up the stairs. I was elated when I heard the voice on the other line pick up and ask me what the problem was. As quietly as I could, I whispered into the phone that there was an intruder in my home, and then I gave the dispatcher my address. As soon as I finished whispering the address, I fell silent, because I could hear whoever was in my house walking across the upstairs hallways. The light from their flashlight got brighter and brighter through the crack in the door as they got closer to the bathroom. I did my best not to scream as I heard the door handle jiggling as if they were trying to open it. However, I couldn't hold back anymore once the person started throwing their body against the door to force it open. The 911 operator reassured me that someone was on the way to my location and that help would be there soon, but there wasn't much that I could do. I just about jumped out of my skin as the door gave out and busted wide open. I couldn't see anything past the flashlight shining in my face as the intruder got closer. I dropped my phone as they grabbed me and pulled me across the floor and out into the hallway. Through my tears, I asked them why they were doing this, and all they replied was, "You know why." Within a second, I recognized the voice of the intruder as my ex-husband, Josh. I tried to fight back and struggle, but when I did, he just threw my body up against the wall and smacked my head against it. I continued to cry as I fell to the floor, and at that point, I could hear my dog barking in the backyard. My ex continued to talk, but I couldn't quite hear what he was saying as he pushed me down the staircase. By the time I hit the first floor of my house, I was completely disoriented, and I could hear the sound of him running back down the stairs as I tried to crawl away. And once he reached me, he grabbed onto the back of my head, came in close to my ear, and whispered, "No one is going to miss you, you know." And just as he got ready to smash my face into the floor, I heard the sound of the front door kicking open as 3 officers rushed into my home. They quickly got my ex-husband off of me and arrested him before getting a statement from me about what had happened. After I had the chance to get my phone, I sent a message to Clark to let him know that I had to cancel our date that night. However, a few seconds later after I sent the message, one of the officers walked up to me and showed me my ex-husband's phone. I was shocked when I saw the message I had just sent went straight to him. It was at that moment I realized that my ex had created a fake account under the name Clark to make sure that I wasn't dating anyone else. If I hadn't managed to call the police in time, I really don't know what would have happened to me. I'll never listen to any of my friends again after they suggested I download Tinder. I just found out that my boyfriend had cheated on me, and after I broke up with him, they told me to get over him by meeting someone new. Normally, I didn't take their suggestions when it came to dating, but for some reason this time I decided to download Tinder as they said, and within minutes I was talking to someone that seemed pretty interesting. We talked for a while, and then eventually he asked me out on a date, which I was admittedly excited about, but I couldn't help but be wary. I told him that I would meet him at the diner between both of our houses and that I would drive there myself just in case the date was a bust. He agreed without an argument, which I took as a good sign, but that feeling that I had about him went away about 20 minutes after I showed up at the diner. We planned to meet up at around 6 p.m. to get dinner, but it was already almost 6:30 and he was nowhere to be found. I actually ended up ordering and eating an entire meal by myself before I ultimately decided to call it quits. I sent him a message that basically told him to go kick rocks, but I was surprised when he responded almost immediately with an apology. He told me that he was right outside and understood if I'd rather just go home since I already ate. I immediately got a weird feeling in my gut because I didn't know how he could know that I had eaten without him. I didn't say anything about that in my message. I began looking around to see if anyone was looking at me, but the diner was actually pretty empty that night. I didn't like the feeling that I was getting, and I decided to ask the waitress if one of the busboys or cooks would be able to walk me to my car, and they graciously accepted. However, even though I felt a bit safer knowing that someone was walking with me, I couldn't help but feel like something was going to go wrong that night. We walked out of the diner and I pointed out my car as we looked around to see if there was anyone outside. We couldn't see anyone though, so I began making my way over to where I was parked, and about halfway to my car, I thanked the cook that walked me out and I told him that I was fine from there. He told me that he would wait by the door until I pulled out of the parking lot, and I'm forever grateful that he did. Nothing happened outside of my car, but when I got into it, I couldn't help but get that strange, ominous feeling again, like something was about to happen. Chills ran down my spine, but I figured that it was just the strange feeling I'd gotten earlier and decided to turn my car on and get ready to leave. As I turned the key in the ignition though, I realized why I felt as if I was in danger. It's because I was. As soon as the car turned on, I felt a pair of hands reach out from the back seat and grip around my neck. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I began flailing my arms and trying to break out of the grasp of whoever was choking me, and in the process, I ended up hitting the horn for a second. That's what gave me the idea to just slam on the horn with both hands and hold it down to alert anyone in the diner that there was something happening. And thankfully, the cook had waited by the door just like he promised. My eyes began to water as the man in my back seat continued to choke me, but I could see through the tears that the cook was running over. My attacker must have seen it too, because at that moment he decided to let go and then quickly stumbled outside of the passenger side of the back seat. He managed to get away since the cook was more concerned with my safety, but I made a statement to the police and filed a report, and thankfully about 2 weeks later I got a call saying that they caught the guy. Apparently, the diner had cameras outside that got footage of the man when he was breaking into my car and hiding in the back seat, and the footage was used to help make the arrest. All I know is that I deleted Tinder and never looked back. Shortly after college, I ended up going through a pretty rough breakup with my longtime girlfriend, and needless to say that I didn't put myself right back out into the dating world. and by the time I decided I was ready to try to find someone again, dating apps had become all the rage. The one that everyone was talking about and that I ended up finding the easiest to use was Tinder. However, not all dates on that app turn out to be good ones, or even safe ones for that matter. For a while I kept making matches, but it seemed like it was with bot accounts, and it wasn't until my second week or so on the app that I connected with someone that I felt safe enough to say was a real person. And the two of us hit it off great. We talked about the music that we liked and all of our favorite movies before eventually deciding that maybe we should meet up in person. When we planned on meeting, she explained to me that she didn't have a car of her own and would need me to pick her up from her house. I told her that was no problem. I could pick her up before taking her out to a local restaurant that she claimed to love and was actually my favorite place to eat in my town. I had to work on the day that we planned our date, so I told her that I wouldn't be able to come pick her up until about 7:30 or so, and she said that was fine. So when the night finally came, I got off work, ran back to my apartment to shower, and then went to grab her. I pulled up to her house and was pleased to see that it wasn't a fake profile, and the person I had been talking to was actually the person that I was there to meet. She got into the car, and after we officially introduced ourselves in person, I began driving us to the restaurant. I made sure to drive slowly and safely, considering it had just started to rain despite it being sunny all day. But thankfully by that point in the night in our small town, the roads were mostly empty. We were about halfway between her house and the restaurant when she looked at her phone as if she received a message. She immediately looked distraught, and when I asked her what was wrong, she said that she just got a text from her friend who said that my date forgot the clothes that she needed for work at her apartment. That was when my date started saying that she really needed those clothes because she couldn't lose her job, so I tried to calm her down by telling her that I would take her back to pick up the clothes after we had dinner. But that was when she told me that we wouldn't have to go before we ate because her friend was going out. I was a little annoyed, but it really wasn't a big deal, so I told her to give me directions to her friend's house and we would pick up her clothes. We drove about 30 minutes out of town, and right before I was getting ready to ask her where she was taking me, she pointed out a driveway up ahead and claimed that it was her friend's house. As we pulled into the driveway though, I noticed that the house looked really dark and almost like no one was living there. But she didn't say anything, so I continued up the driveway and eventually parked right out front. I expected my date to go and meet her friend, but instead, she simply sat in the car looking out the window into the rain. As I tried to look past her to see what she was looking at, I failed to notice the person walking up to the side of my car. I felt my car door open up behind me, and before I could turn around, someone began trying to pull me out of my seat. I tried to fight back, but that was when I felt something sharp dig into my lower back. It was as if someone had taken the wind out of my chest as I couldn't seem to find my breath. That was when I felt that sharp digging feeling again. And when I looked down, I noticed that whoever was trying to pull me from my car had just stabbed me. I looked up at the man, but I couldn't see his face through the darkness. By that point, I had lost a lot of blood, and I didn't really have the energy to fight back. And that was when I noticed my date wasn't trying to help me or call the police. No, instead she started unbuckling my seatbelt so that the man outside the car could pull me out of it faster. Before I knew it, I was being dropped onto the wet ground, and without any hesitation, the person who attacked me stepped over my body and into the car. They pulled out the driveway as I bled out on the ground with no way of calling for help. The world around me started to go dark right before I noticed a set of headlights that seemed to be driving towards me. And the next thing I remember, I was waking up in a hospital 18 hours later with more than 24 stitches in my back. Thankfully, the police were able to use the information I gave them to track down the girl that had set me up on Tinder, but they couldn't track down my car or the person who had stabbed me. Sometimes traveling isn't all it's cracked up to be. In fact, I actually ended up getting into what I would probably call the scariest situation I'd ever been in throughout my entire life while I was spending the last week of my cross-country trip in Florida. I had managed to travel from Connecticut to Oregon and then back to Florida without any problems, so I figured that I could really relax and enjoy myself a bit since I was at the end of my trip. The last city that I stopped in before heading back home was Tampa, Florida. and on the first night there, I ended up finding a really nice seafood place on the boardwalk right along the ocean. That was when I started talking to a couple of guys who said that they were fishermen and actually caught most of what the restaurant was serving. We got to talking and I told them what I had just spent the summer doing, and eventually we started talking about work. I explained to them that I was in the financial department of a small company back in the town where I'm from. I also explained to them that I used to fish all the time, but sadly had never been deep-sea fishing even though I've always wanted to go. Surprisingly enough, they actually invited me to go out with them the following morning and spend the day on the water. Now normally, I never accept an invitation like that from people that I didn't know, but if there was one thing that I thought I learned throughout my traveling, it was that sometimes you need to trust people to get the best out of your experiences in life. The following morning, I made sure to be up at 3 a.m. to meet the two fishermen out on the docks, and by the time I met up with them, the sun was just beginning to peek out over the horizon. We made our way out onto the water, and in less than an hour we couldn't even see the shore. We were surrounded by the open ocean, and for a while, I couldn't have been more ecstatic. However, after another hour or so of cruising, I ended up asking one of the men where we were going to be fishing and what sort of catches I should be expecting. But instead of giving me a direct answer, one of them just responded by saying, "You'll see," which made the other one chuckle a little bit. I decided not to ask any more questions, and instead, I began walking around the boat checking out any fishing gear that I came across, which was when I noticed an apparent lack of any. I looked over the side of the boat and realized that there weren't any other boats around us, and at that point, I started to get a really bad feeling in my gut. I turned to head back to the two fishermen, but was surprised to see one of them standing right behind me. Before I could say anything, he grabbed me by the collar and said, "Come on, we need to talk to you," before he dragged me across the boat. He threw me down in the seat right across from the fisherman captaining the boat, and right away they started talking about my job. Then the man controlling the boat started saying that it must have cost a lot of money for me to travel as I had. I knew that something was wrong, and I tried to explain to the men that my job didn't really pay that well, and I only had the money to travel because I saved up for like 5 years, but they didn't believe me. The man who had grabbed me earlier picked me up from my seat and then started patting me down before he took my wallet, my phone, and my watch. He asked me the PIN to my debit card and I told him that I didn't know it. But he wasn't a very patient man as he immediately stuck me square in the nose before asking me for the number again. This time I answered by giving him a fake 4-digit code. The man took a minute to write the code down and then continued to ask me questions about my finances before finally giving me one last bit of advice. I'll never forget the look in his eyes when he said, "If you do end up surviving this, remember that we know where you live, yeah?" He then showed me my ID to prove he had my address and then grabbed me by the collar once again before dragging me to the side of the boat and then tossing me overboard. I scrambled to stay upright and find the surface as I tumbled into the water. I gasped for air as soon as my head breached the surface and watched the fisherman who just robbed me continue sailing away. The first few minutes in the water were the worst because I was trying to fight the immediate panic of not knowing where the land was and having no way of contacting anyone for help. As time passed, I was able to calm myself down, but every couple of minutes, every time I remembered the situation I was in, I couldn't help but freak out a bit. I floated there for hours as the sun rose and then crossed over the sky. At a point, I noticed that it was starting to head back down, and I knew that if I wasn't seen by a ship before dusk, there was little to no chance of anyone finding me that night. Thankfully, as I was just about to give up hope, I noticed a shimmer in the distance that turned out to be a different fishing boat heading back to shore. I began flailing my bright yellow shirt around in hopes of them being able to see it, and to my surprise, they began heading right toward me. It was a 1 in a million chance, but I couldn't have been more grateful when the boat managed to pick me up. They brought me back to shore and I immediately went to the police station. After reporting the incident, they told me that they would let me know if they turned up anything and then call my sister, who was gracious enough to drive to Florida, to pick me up. When I was 24 years old, I went on a solo road trip from Arkansas to Canada. Traveling from the southern United States all through the northern states and then into the beautiful country of Canada is something that I will gladly never forget. The way back is an entirely different story though. and I would give almost anything to forget the night of the trip when my tire popped. It started as I made my way out of Minnesota on my way to Arkansas. I was crossing state lines when I heard the sound that I had dreaded hearing on my entire trip, the sound of a tire popping. I was driving down one of the side roads that ran separately from the highway when I heard the booming sound of the tire popping and slowly pulled off to the side of the road. I sat in the driver's seat lamenting my situation as I remembered that I didn't have a spare tire to quickly swap it out for. I looked at the clock in my car and saw that even though it was dark, it was only 7:25 p.m., and I decided that it was still early enough for me to ask for help. You see, this was around 2001 when not everyone had a cell phone yet, and I was one of the few who didn't have one. This meant that I had to figure out how to get help the old-fashioned way by knocking on someone's door. I got out of my car and looked down the road ahead of me and then behind me, and I noticed what looked like a gravel driveway down the street in the direction I was coming from. I made sure that the car was locked and then began walking in the grass that lined the side of the road as I made my way over to the driveway that I had seen. As I got closer to the entrance, I just hoped and prayed that someone was home, and to my joyous surprise, I could see a house far down at the end of the driveway with a light on in the front window. I started making my way down the driveway, but almost as soon as I stepped on the property, something in the back of my head was telling me to turn back. I tried to shake the feeling off as I continued up the driveway, but I couldn't help but look into the dark woods around me that sat on both sides of the path. Even though I couldn't see anything, it was like I knew that there was something out there. I decided to pick up the pace a little bit as I got more and more on edge, and I quickly made my way to the front porch of the home and then up the stairs. I knocked on the door and then took a step back, hoping that someone would come to the door, but no one did. After a minute, I knocked again, but this time my knock was followed by the sound of leaves crunching to my left. I looked over toward the woods where the noise came from as I waited and hoped for the front door to open, but it never did. I kept looking in the direction of the noise, and through the darkness, I could swear that I saw someone standing. I took a step back as my eyes tried to adjust to see the figure standing in the trees better, but I couldn't see a thing. My breathing grew heavy as I tried to calm myself down, but eventually I couldn't take it anymore and ended up heading back to my car. I kept looking over my shoulder with each step that I took, but I couldn't see anything. I made my way out onto the road and then back to my car as fast as I could, and once I was safely inside, I made sure to lock the door and turn the lights on so that I could see better. I sat there anxiously watching the rearview mirror, wondering if I was going to see what had been following me before, and to my horror, I saw it. Standing about 20 feet away from the car, illuminated by the brake lights, I saw the shadow of what looked like a man that was walking toward me. I began to panic as I tried to consider if I should drive and potentially ruin the rim of the car or not, but thankfully, I didn't have to. As I tried to figure out what to do, I looked back into the rearview mirror, but was blinded by a pair of headlights that were coming down the road. To my surprise, the other car stopped about 10 feet ahead of me and leaned out of their window asking if I needed any help. I asked them if they saw anyone standing behind my car, and they sort of looked at me like I was crazy, but then they told me that they didn't see anything. I ended up explaining my situation to them, and they were nice enough to sell me the spare tire that they had in their car for $20. They even held a flashlight for me as I changed the tire. Needless to say though, despite the amazing hospitality from that stranger, as soon as I was able to drive away from that area, I did. My friends always used to make fun of me because I was what they called a cheap traveler, mainly because I preferred to stay at motels rather than hotels. They used to tell me things like, it's not safe for a girl to stay in motel rooms by herself, but I just found them to be less expensive for basically the same amenities. However, I did eventually learn that sometimes when you're traveling, it's better to spend a little extra money on a hotel just for safety purposes alone. You see, I was on my way back to Texas after visiting some family in New York, and I decided to drive so I knew that I had a long trip ahead of me. On the first night of the drive, I ended up staying at a Red Roof Inn that was located in Kentucky. My first night at the motel wasn't bad at all. I got in about 8:50 and ended up taking a shower with surprisingly hot water and then passed out shortly after. The first bummer of that leg of my travels was when I woke up the next morning and saw that it had snowed a lot overnight and I wasn't going to be able to get on the road that day. The first thing that I did was head over to the front desk so that I could extend my stay for another night. As I made my way there, I saw a disheveled-looking man who appeared to be homeless. I remembered him as I was extending my stay, and before leaving the office area, I poured a cup of coffee and walked it out to him as I made my way back to my room. He thanked me, and then we had a brief conversation before I told him to have a nice day and went back to my room. As I sat in my room, I thought about his situation and about how cold it was outside, and I figured that I had saved up enough money on the trip that I could spring for another room. I went outside to find him to see if he would want me to get a room for him so he could get warm and stuff, but I couldn't find him. Over the next couple of hours, I kept looking outside for the man, but he was nowhere to be found, and eventually I stopped looking. As the day dragged on, the snow piling up on the roads wasn't getting any better. I looked at my phone and saw that there was a grocery store about 5 minutes away on foot, and I decided to take the walk to get something to eat for the night. I forgot how quickly it got dark during the winter though, because by the time I was on my way back to the Red Roof with a microwavable pizza, it was practically dark out. I made my way to my room, and when I unlocked the door, I noticed that there were dirty boot prints on the carpeted floor. I thought about it for a second, but eventually figured that they must have been there the whole time and I just didn't notice. I took my coat off and then went to put the pizza in the microwave when I heard a noise coming from the motel bathroom. I turned to face the bathroom and noticed the door was closed, which was strange because I was positive that I had left it open. I listened closely. My eyes grew wide as I heard what I was almost sure was the sound of someone breathing heavily. I took a step back and turned to walk out of my room into the office, but before I could make it to the door, I heard the click of the bathroom door opening. I turned and watched the door open, and I let out a loud scream as I saw the man who I had given a coffee to earlier that day. He started running across the room toward me, but I was already out of the door. The man followed me into the dark motel courtyard as I ran toward the office, and just as I was about 10 feet away from the door, he caught me. I felt the wind get knocked out of my lungs as I was tackled to the snow-covered ground. I tried to scream, but nothing would come out. That was when I heard him whisper in my ear that we were going to go back into my room quickly and quietly. My eyes began to water as I tried to figure out what I could do. That was when I heard the beautiful sound of the bells that indicated the front door of the office opening up. The man dropped me back down to the floor as we both heard someone yelling from the office for him to get off me. I looked up and saw a woman running over to me, and thankfully the man who was attacking me ran off. The woman brought me into the office, and we waited for the police together behind the locked door. The two officers escorted me to my room to gather my things because the manager was letting me change to a different room, and there were 2 more officers searching the area for the man who attacked me. I didn't really get any sleep that night, and as soon as the sun was up, I decided to hit the road. I checked out the motel, thanked the woman who helped me out the previous night, and as soon as I left the state, I never looked back. Hopefully, they ended up finding that man.